When I first set foot on American soil in 1831, I witnessed something unprecedented in human history, a society born free, yet wrestling with contradictions that would define the very essence of democratic life. Americans had achieved what Europeans could only dream of: equality without revolution, liberty without anarchy. Yet beneath this remarkable achievement lay a paradox so fundamental that it escaped the notice of those living within it. This was a nation that proclaimed the inherent equality of all men while simultaneously creating new forms of hierarchy, a society that celebrated individual freedom while generating pressures toward conformity more subtle yet more powerful than any European tyranny. The very success of American democracy contained the seeds of its greatest challenges. What I observed was not merely a political experiment, but a glimpse into the future of all democratic societies, a future where the greatest threats to liberty would come not from kings or nobles, but from the people themselves. Chapter 1: The Equality Revolution That Changed Everything. The transformation I witnessed in America was nothing short of revolutionary, though it occurred without guillotines or barricades. Here was a society where the principle of equality had penetrated so deeply into daily life that Americans could scarcely imagine any other arrangement. In Europe, I had known a world where birth determined destiny, where social hierarchies were as fixed as the stars. But in America, I discovered a society where, theoretically, any man might rise to any position through merit and effort alone. Yet this equality revolution created its own peculiar dynamics. Americans had developed what I called the aristocracy of manufacturers, a new form of social stratification based not on inherited title, but on industrial wealth. Factory owners commanded workers with an authority that paralleled European nobles, yet this relationship was justified by democratic ideology rather than divine right. The worker, though legally equal to his employer, found himself trapped in a dependence more complete than feudal bonds. More fascinating still was how equality of conditions shaped American character itself. Where European aristocracy had cultivated refinement through leisure and inherited culture, American equality produced a restless energy, an endless seeking for improvement and advancement. Americans were simultaneously the freest and most anxious people I had encountered. Their equality freed them from traditional constraints, yet burdened them with the weight of unlimited possibility. This equality extended beyond mere social relations to reshape fundamental concepts of truth and authority. In aristocratic societies, wisdom descended from established institutions and learned elites. In America, I observed the radical democratization of knowledge itself. Every man considered himself competent to judge political, moral, and even theological questions. This intellectual equality liberated enormous creative energy, yet it also produced a dangerous susceptibility to popular delusions and the tyranny of prevailing opinion. The American equality revolution had succeeded beyond European imagination, yet it had also created new forms of inequality and new challenges to human dignity. Understanding this paradox was essential to grasping the future trajectory of democratic civilization itself. Chapter 2: The Tyranny of the Majority, Democracy's Hidden Danger. In aristocratic societies, tyranny wore the face of a single despot or privileged class. But in America, I discovered a more subtle and perhaps more dangerous form of oppression, the tyranny of the majority. This was not the crude domination of physical force, but something far more insidious, the gradual suffocation of independent thought and minority opinion under the weight of democratic conformity. The mechanism was as brilliant as it was terrifying. In a society where political legitimacy derived from popular will, who could oppose what the majority deemed proper? Americans had created a system where dissent from popular opinion became not merely politically difficult, but morally suspect. The minority could not claim divine right, inherited privilege, or superior education as justification for resistance. They stood naked before the judgment of their equal fellow citizens. This majority tyranny operated through social rather than legal coercion. Americans rarely needed laws to enforce conformity when public opinion proved so effective. I witnessed how quickly unconventional ideas or behaviors met with social ostracism, economic boycott, and moral condemnation. The penalty for nonconformity was not imprisonment or execution, but something American individualists found equally terrifying: exclusion from the democratic community itself. The press, rather than serving as a check on this conformity, often amplified it. Newspapers, dependent on popular approval for circulation and advertising revenue, rarely challenged prevailing prejudices. Instead, they fed the public's appetite for confirmation of existing beliefs. The result was an information environment that reinforced rather than questioned majority opinion. Political institutions offered little protection for minority rights. Elected officials, dependent on popular approval for their positions, had every incentive to follow rather than challenge public sentiment. Even the judiciary, though nominally independent, could not long resist sustained majority pressure without losing legitimacy. Perhaps most disturbing was how majority tyranny operated on the level of thought itself. Americans, surrounded by democratic equality, found it nearly impossible to conceive that the majority might be wrong. If all men were created equal, how could a minority claim superior insight? This democratic logic made intellectual independence not merely difficult, but seemingly illegitimate. The tyranny of the majority represented democracy's greatest internal threat, the possibility that freedom itself might be voted away by free people convinced they were acting in liberty's name. Chapter 3: The Mediating Power of Civil Society. Yet Americans had discovered something remarkable that offered hope against the dangers of majority tyranny: the mediating power of civil society. Nowhere in the world had I encountered such a proliferation of voluntary associations, from political clubs to charitable societies, from professional organizations to religious congregations. Americans seemed incapable of addressing any public concern without immediately forming an association. These associations served as crucial buffers between the individual and the state, creating intermediate sources of authority and identity that could resist both governmental overreach and majoritarian oppression. When Americans joined together in pursuit of common purposes, they learned the habits of democratic cooperation while maintaining spaces for diverse opinions and interests. I was struck by how associations educated Americans in the art of democratic participation. In these smaller groups, citizens learned to deliberate, compromise, and work together across differences of opinion and background. They discovered that democratic politics required not merely voting, but the more difficult arts of persuasion, negotiation, and coalition building. Associations served as schools of democracy where Americans practiced the skills necessary for larger civic engagement. Religious associations played a particularly vital role in this democratic education. Though Americans had separated church and state, they had not separated religion from public life. Churches provided moral foundations for democratic citizenship while offering alternative sources of authority to majoritarian opinion. Religious conviction could give individuals the courage to resist popular pressure when conscience demanded it. Professional and economic associations created networks of interest and identity that cross-cut purely geographical or political divisions. A merchant might find common cause with merchants in distant states against local political pressures. These associations created what we might call a federal structure of civil society that paralleled and reinforced American political federalism. Yet I observed that civil society's strength depended on active participation. Americans who withdrew from associational life into pure individualism weakened not only themselves but the entire democratic fabric. The vitality of American democracy rested on citizens' willingness to engage in the work of community building and civic participation. How does your own participation in community organizations contribute to democratic life? Consider how your involvement in voluntary associations, from neighborhood groups to professional organizations, helps maintain the mediating structures that protect individual liberty while fostering democratic cooperation. The health of American democracy would ultimately depend on whether future generations maintain this tradition of associational engagement or succumb to the atomizing tendencies of modern life. Chapter 4: Individualism, Democracy's Double-Edged Gift. Democracy had given birth to a new type of human being, the democratic individual. Unlike the aristocrat, who defined himself through inherited status and social relationships, or the subject, who found identity in submission to authority, the democratic individual stood alone, equal to every other, responsible for creating his own destiny. This was both democracy's greatest achievement and its most dangerous vulnerability. American individualism differed fundamentally from mere selfishness or egoism. It represented a philosophical conviction that each person possessed inherent dignity and rights independent of social position or collective approval. This individualism had liberated Americans from the mental chains of traditional hierarchy, enabling unprecedented creativity, innovation, and personal development. Yet this same individualism contained destructive potential. When taken to extremes, it encouraged Americans to withdraw from public life into private concerns, weakening the civic bonds necessary for democratic governance. I observed how some Americans, convinced of their self-sufficiency, lost interest in the common good that made their individual prosperity possible. Democratic individualism also produced a paradoxical conformity. Freed from traditional authorities, Americans became peculiarly susceptible to the opinion of their democratic equals. Lacking inherited standards of judgment, they looked to contemporary public opinion for guidance on everything from fashion to morality. The result was a society of individuals who were simultaneously independent and conformist. The economic dimensions of American individualism created additional complications. The same democratic spirit that proclaimed political equality seemed to justify unlimited economic inequality. Americans who would never accept inherited political privilege readily accepted vast disparities in wealth and economic power, provided these resulted from individual effort rather than inherited advantage. This individualistic ethos also affected family relationships and social bonds. While Americans maintained strong family ties, these were understood as voluntary associations based on affection rather than duty or tradition. Marriage became a contract between equals rather than a hierarchical institution. Children were raised to independence rather than submission. These changes strengthened individual autonomy while potentially weakening social solidarity. The challenge for American democracy was learning to balance individual freedom with collective responsibility. Too little individualism would stifle the creativity and innovation that made democracy dynamic. Too much would dissolve the social bonds that made democratic cooperation possible. Americans needed to discover forms of individualism that enhanced rather than undermined civic engagement, an individualism that recognized personal fulfillment as intimately connected to the health of the democratic community. Chapter 5: Religion and Morality, Democracy's Essential Foundation. Perhaps the most surprising discovery of my American journey was the vital role that religion played in sustaining democratic institutions. In Europe, we had assumed that the advance of democratic equality would necessarily weaken religious belief and authority. Yet in America, I found religion and democracy flourishing together in mutually supportive harmony. Americans had achieved something unprecedented: the separation of church and state without the separation of religion from public life. No established church possessed legal privilege, yet religious influence permeated American culture and politics. This arrangement benefited both religion and democracy. Churches, freed from dependence on political authority, developed their own vitality and moral authority. Democracy, in turn, gained access to moral resources necessary for just governance. Religion provided Americans with moral standards independent of majority opinion. When democratic politics threatened to reduce all questions to matters of preference or interest, religious conviction offered transcendent criteria for judgment. A religious American could resist popular pressure by appealing to divine authority higher than human consensus. This gave democratic minorities crucial resources for moral resistance against majoritarian oppression. The practical effects of religious influence on American democracy were profound. Religious Americans approached politics with a sense of moral responsibility that elevated democratic discourse above mere bargaining between interests. They understood political participation as a form of stewardship, answerable to divine judgment. This religious sensibility helped prevent the corruption and cynicism that plagued democracies lacking moral foundations. American religious diversity created additional benefits for democratic culture. With multiple denominations competing for adherence through persuasion rather than coercion, Americans learned habits of tolerance and dialogue essential for democratic citizenship. Religious competition produced innovation and vitality that benefited both faith and democratic culture. Yet I also observed potential dangers in the relationship between religion and democracy. When religious conviction became too closely identified with particular political positions, it could intensify rather than moderate democratic conflict. Religious certainty could justify political intolerance, undermining the spirit of compromise necessary for democratic governance. The voluntary character of American religion created both opportunities and vulnerabilities. Free religious choice strengthened personal faith while potentially weakening institutional authority. Churches dependent on voluntary support had every incentive to adapt to popular preferences, possibly compromising prophetic witness to unpopular truths. What sources of moral authority guide your own civic engagement? Consider how your deepest convictions, whether religious or secular, shape your approach to democratic participation and your willingness to resist popular pressure when conscience demands it. The future of American democracy would depend significantly on whether religious and moral institutions could maintain their vital role without compromising either their independence or democratic values. Chapter 6: The Eternal Tension, Freedom versus Equality. At the heart of American democracy lay a tension so fundamental that it shaped every aspect of national life: the competition between freedom and equality. These two ideals, both essential to democratic civilization, existed in perpetual tension with each other. Americans had achieved remarkable success in balancing them, yet this balance remained precarious and required constant vigilance to maintain. The passion for equality, I observed, was democracy's strongest and most dangerous impulse. Americans loved equality with an intensity that amazed European observers accustomed to inherited hierarchy. This passion had destroyed traditional aristocracy and created unprecedented opportunities for individual advancement. Yet it also threatened to destroy the very freedom it was meant to protect. Equality could justify limitations on freedom when such limitations appeared to serve the general welfare. If all citizens were truly equal, why should any individual claim special rights or privileges? Why should minority preferences override majority will? The logic of equality could lead to a soft despotism where democratic government regulated every aspect of life in the name of equal treatment and common good. Freedom, conversely, inevitably produced inequality. When individuals were truly free to pursue their own interests and develop their own talents, some would achieve more than others. Freedom of association led to exclusive clubs. Freedom of enterprise created economic hierarchies. Freedom of thought produced intellectual elites. These inequalities, though resulting from free choices, challenged the democratic commitment to equality. Americans had developed ingenious methods for managing this tension. Their federal system allowed different communities to strike different balances between freedom and equality. Their market economy channeled competitive energies into productive rather than destructive directions. Their civil society created multiple sources of status and achievement that prevented any single hierarchy from dominating. Yet the tension persisted and intensified as democracy matured. Each generation faced the challenge of preserving freedom against equality's encroachments while maintaining equality against freedom's excesses. The temptation was always to sacrifice one value completely for the other, leading either to anarchic individualism or democratic despotism. Historical experience suggested that equality tended to gain ground over time in democratic societies. The logic of democratic legitimacy favored equal treatment over individual exception. Popular pressure supported policies that reduced distinctions and differences. The challenge for American democracy was learning to resist equality's excesses without abandoning its legitimate claims. Success in managing this tension required not philosophical resolution, for the tension was inherent and irreducible, but practical wisdom in striking appropriate balances for particular times and circumstances. Americans needed to understand that preserving democracy required protecting both freedom and equality, even when they conflicted with each other. The art of democratic statesmanship lay in knowing when to emphasize freedom and when to emphasize equality, while never completely sacrificing either to the other. Chapter 7: America's Democratic Experiment and the World's Future. What I witnessed in America was not merely one nation's political experiment, but a preview of humanity's democratic future. The forces that had shaped American society, the passion for equality, the love of freedom, the power of public opinion, the challenges of balancing individual rights with collective needs, would eventually transform all civilized nations. America was democracy's laboratory, testing principles and practices that would spread throughout the world. The American experiment demonstrated both democracy's immense potential and its inherent limitations. Americans had proven that large-scale democratic government was possible, that ordinary citizens could govern themselves without descending into anarchy or tyranny. They had shown how democratic institutions could channel popular energies into constructive rather than destructive directions, creating unprecedented prosperity and innovation. Yet America also revealed democracy's persistent vulnerabilities. The tyranny of the majority remained a constant threat. The tension between freedom and equality continued to generate conflict. The individualism that energized democratic society also threatened to dissolve democratic bonds. The very success of democratic institutions created new challenges that required constant adaptation and vigilance. Modern technology has intensified both democratic promises and dangers that I first observed in America. The same communications revolution that can enhance democratic participation also enables the rapid spread of misinformation and the manipulation of public opinion. The global economy that spreads democratic values also creates new forms of inequality and dependence that challenge democratic governance. Contemporary American challenges: political polarization, declining institutional trust, the rise of social media echo chambers, represent intensified versions of tensions I identified in the 1830s. The fundamental questions remain the same. How can democratic societies balance majority rule with minority rights? How can they maintain unity while respecting diversity? How can they preserve freedom while ensuring equality? The lessons of American democracy remain relevant for all societies struggling with these challenges. The vital importance of civil society, the necessity of moral foundations, the value of federalism and institutional diversity, the need for active civic participation, these insights apply wherever democratic government is attempted. Yet each society must adapt democratic principles to its own history, culture, and circumstances. What works in America may not work elsewhere without modification. The art of democratic statesmanship lies in understanding which principles are universal and which must be adapted to local conditions. The future of democracy worldwide depends on whether democratic peoples can learn from both the successes and failures of the American experiment. Americans pioneered democratic institutions for the modern world. Now all democratic societies must work together to refine and improve these institutions for future generations. The American paradox, a society simultaneously free and conformist, equal and hierarchical, individualistic and communal, offers both hope and warning for democracy's global future. Understanding this paradox remains essential for anyone who hopes to preserve and strengthen democratic civilization in an uncertain world. Conclusion. The American paradox I discovered in the 1830s persists today, though in evolved forms that reflect changing circumstances while preserving fundamental tensions. Americans remain both the freest and most conformist people, their society simultaneously egalitarian and stratified, their individualism both liberating and isolating. These contradictions are not flaws to be corrected but inherent features of democratic life that require constant attention and careful management. Understanding this paradox offers hope for democracy's future while demanding vigilance against its persistent dangers. The forces that created 19th-century America, the passion for equality, the love of freedom, the power of association, the influence of religion and morality, continue to shape democratic societies worldwide. Learning to balance these forces without destroying their creative tension remains the central challenge of democratic statesmanship. Each generation must rediscover for itself the wisdom necessary to preserve democratic institutions while adapting them to new circumstances. The American experiment continues, no longer confined to one nation but extended to all humanity's democratic aspirations. Its success or failure will determine not only America's fate, but the future of human freedom itself.